Ok, muy buenas tardes y feliz domingo a todos. Aquí estamos en una tarde de lluvia aquí en Oaxaca. Tengo mi tecito. Gracias por esperar. Estoy empezando un poco tarde, pero quería, bueno, I'm doing this in Spanish. I was going to do this in English. All right, here we go. Happy Sunday. We're here on a rainy Sunday in Oaxaca, and I want to get you up to date on a very important event that's going to be happening soon in Mexico that hasn't received a lot of international coverage of yet. And this is the referendum that will be held on Sunday, August 1st, in a little over a month, in which the Mexican public will be heading back to the polls to decide whether or not they want to investigate, or they want former presidents to be investigated and, as appropriate, put on trial for crimes that they have reportedly committed during their administrations. And I want to talk about the implications of this legally and politically, because it's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big deal what's going on down here. So let's talk a little bit first about what the referendum actually is. This referendum law, which allows for a referendum, was originally passed in 2014 and then later amended. And this referendum is actually going to be the first to be held under, the stipulations of this law. The law is rather restrictive in the sense of, in order for a referendum to get on the ballot or to be put to a vote, either 2% of the voting public has to sign a petition for it, or it has to be requested directly by the presidency to Congress. And here's another very important point. In order for it to be binding, 40% of the public who are registered on the national voting roll has to participate in it for it to be legally binding. Now, what's the history of this? This is really interesting because it's one of the initiatives that has really come up from below during the time of López Obrador. López Obrador was elected with an idea of punto final, right? To supposedly leave the crimes of the past behind and look forward, right? It's always a balancing act, with the new progressive government. Do you want to put your energies into enacting your agenda? Especially when you're coming in after a series of governments that committed atrocious crimes. But then again, if you just go with this idea of looking forward, that big word impunity hangs in the air. And of course, when these people get back into power, they can just very much reconstitute the web of criminality that was in play during previous governments. And we'll talk about that a little bit more going forward. So this isn't something that López Obrador was actively promoting. He's always been very vocal in talking about the crimes of previous presidents. He certainly knows them from A to Z, but his idea was not to, or at least ostensibly, was not to hold, was not to go ahead and prosecute. And this is really something that's come from below. It's been a real demand from the bases of, this is something we want to see happen. So last year, the initiative was approved. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court voted 6-5 that it was legal. And so then all of the jockeying began about when was it going to be held. AMLO and Morena said, well, let's just hold it the same day as the midterm elections in 2021. Just have an extra ballot box to decide whether these investigations will be held, right? The right didn't want this because they thought that it would increase turnout for the midterm elections, which is almost certainly true. So they said, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to, if you're going to hold this vote, it has to be on a separate day. So that's why we're having this kind of strange situation where the Mexican public went to the polls, went to the polls for the midterms the beginning of the month, right? Beginning of June, but the actual referendum itself will be held on August 1st. So the public will have to go back out to the polls. And as I pointed out, for it to be legally binding, 40% of the people who are on the voting rolls will have to participate, which is, you know, it's a stiff number to be reached, right? So let's talk a little bit more about what's entailed, right? As you can imagine, the powers that be in previous administrations don't want this referendum to happen. So that's why it went to the court and all of this, you know, lawfare. The court gave the green light. So then the National Electoral Institute said, well, if we're going to hold this referendum, if we're going to be responsible for holding this referendum, then we're going to have to, we're going to need more money. So they asked for, putting it up here, they asked for an extra 1,500,000,000 pesos to carry out this referendum. Now, let's recall that the National Electoral Institute is one of the institutes that has the most costly electoral institutes in the world. So the idea that they needed all this extra money to carry out the referendum was ridiculous, right? And AMLO called them on it and said, use your own resources, you've got plenty. So they sued and went through the whole thing. Finally, the suits from the National Electoral Institute rejected, and they're going to have to carry out the referendum with their own resources. So they're using this now as the perfect excuse to not promote the referendum, to drag their feet. The National Electoral Institute has free time on radio and television that they could be using to promote this referendum. They're not. They haven't yet. They haven't started. They're supposedly going to be starting in July. Why are they taking so long, right? And they've also decided to open many fewer polling places. So you get this interesting situation where of the 2,500 or so municipalities in Oaxaca, apparently only 300 or so are going to have actual precincts for the referendum coming up on August 1st. The whole idea, of course, is to try to delegitimize the referendum, to make it look illegitimate, and to ensure that the requisite 40% of people don't come out to the referendum, and then they can claim that, oh, well, you know, too bad, you know. So obviously we're going to see that day with longer lines, and it's going to be much more difficult to participate in this process. This is a singular moment, however. As of now, you know, in his first 3 years of government, there have been some prosecutions on the part of the AMLO administration. We see that Emilio Lozoya, who was involved in Enrique Peña Nieto's campaign in 2012, was put in prison. He's been accused of triangulating money from the Brazilian company Odebrecht into the Peña Nieto campaign and then giving them kickbacks. Rosario Robles, the development secretary of Enrique Peña Nieto, has also been in jail for quite a while, accused of also a diversion of resources through what was called the estafa maestra, or the master scam, and a whole laundry list of former governors from the PRI and the PAN are either on trial, in jail in some part, in Mexico, United States, or on the lam, right? The most recent is the PAN governor, Cabeza de Vaca, Francisco Garcia Cabeza de Vaca, who's just about to have his political immunity stripped in order for him to face charges of diversion of resources and fraud. That said, though, the process of prosecutions under AMLO's government has been not that fast, shall we say, over the first 3 years. The public has been obviously very willing to give the administration leeway in this, knowing that prosecutions are always slow and you have to compile evidence and go through all the legal hoops. But we're at the halfway point now of AMLO's government, right? And the question is, with the great promise of the fourth transformation to eliminate corruption, right? That was the big, slogan of everything: ending corruption, ending corruption, ending corruption. How can you end corruption if there aren't punishments for the flagrant crimes of the past, right? So the AMLO administration has, there's been some progress on prosecutions, not as much as many people would have liked. Also, in the economic sphere, AMLO has really not ruffled a lot of feathers in the elite, in the sense of he's worked together with, for example, people like Carlos Slim in construction projects and infrastructure and stuff like that. If you see AMLO's set piece speeches, there are always places for members of industry and business there. But here, with this referendum, this is going to be something that directly affects the elite. Because I'm going to share the screen here so you can see what the actual question says. So the question that was sent to the National Electorate was a very direct question about, do you want the ex-president to be put on trial? The Supreme Court massaged the question to make it a lot more ambiguous. And so the question is, are you in favor of the pertinent actions being taken in obeyance of constitutional and the legal and constitutional framework to carry out a process of clarifying the political decisions taken in previous years by political actors in order to guarantee justice and the rights of the possible victims? So that's the question that people are going to be asked to vote on August 1st. And it's a very simple ballot paper, and that's the paper you're going to see right there. As you can imagine, it's a rather popular proposition. In polls, and the numbers vary, but about 81% or so, between 75 and 90% of the public are in favor of this. So there's very little doubt that the referendum will pass on August 1st, and probably by an overwhelming number. The question is more whether it's going to get that legal threshold of 40 million. And then the other question is whether that legal threshold even matters. Because as you saw, the question is ambiguous enough that it doesn't just apply to past presidents, but rather all political actors and previous administrations, with the goal of guaranteeing justice and the rights of the victims of these potential crimes. So it's really much more of a political referendum, in the sense that AMLO does not want to be seen as him personally pointing the finger and going after ex-presidents, right? To give them another excuse to paint him as an authoritarian, a dictator, right? Trying to put his opponents in prison. So AMLO's been trying to take as much distance from this as he possibly can, logically, right? This isn't my decision. This is a referendum. This has been generated by the popular will, and they'll give the final decision on it. He's even said he's not going to vote on it at all. He's not going to participate. although he was actually the one who sent the initiative to Congress in the first place, right? So whether or not it hits the 40%, if and when it wins, it will certainly up the stakes for the AMLO administration, because the question will then be, how can he not then go ahead and investigate his attorney general's office, not him personally? How can he then not go ahead and investigate the crimes of the past if the public, if they open the door to a referendum and it won, whether or not it hit the 40 million mark? So the stakes will be raised significantly, because it's going to be that much harder then for the administration to kind of soft shoe prosecuting crimes of previous administrations once this has taken place. It will have happened, right? This referendum, and the public will, to a certain degree, will have been expressed. So it raises the stakes, and it really opens the door to something that has never happened in Mexico, which is a process of investigating the massive impunity that reigned in previous administrations, and this kind of tacit understanding that presidents would never be touched. No president would ever be touched. No Mexican president, in this post-revolutionary period, except for Calles, who was exiled in the early days, but in recent times has been touched for crimes committed. They've always been above the law. Any immunity they've enjoyed during office has carried over to after office, their entire lives. Right? So breaking with this tacit tradition is a big deal. And there's certainly a lot to investigate, and that's saying it mildly. So just they're actually talking about investigating the last 5 former presidents. So that's include Carlos Salinas de Gortari, who was elected in the fraudulent elections of 1988 for influence trafficking, all of this shady privatizations. He privatized large chunks of the Mexican state, including the banks, and to a bunch of cronies, a crony capitalist sell-off of the Mexican state illegally, in a lot of cases, not following any of the rules of licitations and contracts, any of the rest. Illicit enrichment and the whole scheme of privatizations, which made himself and his family and his cronies incredibly rich, filthy rich. That's Carlos Salinas de Gortari. Then his successor, Ernesto Zedillo Ponce de Leon, elected in 1994. The 3 big massacres of his presidency, Acteal in 1997 in Zapatista territory in Chiapas, El Charco in Guerrero, Aguas Blancas. These are massacres that have never been brought to justice. And this is actually why Ernesto Zedillo has been hiding out in the United States all these years, hiding out in Connecticut, right, to try to avoid being prosecuted for these crimes of lesa humanidad, right? Not to mention the FOBA Proa, which I've written about in Jacobin, the bailout of the banks, privatized by Salinas de Gortari, and then rescued, right, bailed out by the Mexican public in a bailout that's the public's going to pay until 2070, converting private debts, probably illegally in a lot of cases, into public debt, and bailing out these banks, which were then turned around and sold off to foreign banking interests. The major, major scandal of the 20th century in Mexico that we'll be paying for generations in Mexico. Vicente Fox for the absolutely cruel repression in Atenco, when the residents of Atenco were rising up against plans to put a new airport in the area, which was eventually canceled by AMLO. The repression and the violations of human rights were brutal. And Enrique Peña Nieto, who was the governor of Mexico State at that time, participated directly in that. The escape of the Chapo Guzman from prison. I mean, he just almost walked out of prison. The encyclomedia scandal. The enrichment of the Bribascas, right? His sons-in-law, the sons of Marta Sahagún. The repression of the popular movement in Oaxaca in 2006, in November 2006, which I witnessed. Again, enormous violations of human rights that have never been tried and never been brought to justice. Felipe Calderon, for this war on drugs, which caused the deaths of several 100,000 people directly or indirectly. The ABC nursery, where several dozen nursery children were burned to death in a nursery, in a series of nurseries that had been privatized and privatized out, and the nursery was in an unsafe location, and it caught fire. The Estela de Luz monument and all of the graft in Mexico City and all the graft and corruption involved in that. Recently, the participation of Calderon in the creation of the private prison industry, and creating a whole network of private prisons to cronies and buddies there. The corruption in the Calderon administration was endless. Enrique Peña Nieto, the most notorious was the disappearance of the 43 teaching students in Ayotzinapa, which has never been brought to justice. The Casablanca White House scandal, where a favorite contractor gave his then wife a house as a gift, or almost a gift, in the Lomas district of Mexico City. The Odebrecht case, which I mentioned, which was dirty money financing his campaign which spent 13 or 14 times more than the legal spending limit. Odebrecht basically bribed the Peña Nieto campaign in order to get kickbacks and contracts. The Master Scandal, which I talked about, which took government money and funneled it through universities and shell companies in order to get into people's pockets. We're talking about, it's hard to exaggerate the extent of the corruption of these previous administrations. It would sound silly. It would sound ridiculous. It would sound like you're making things up. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Western media, in large cases, ignored a lot of these, in part because of this rather racist stereotype that, oh, well, Mexico's corrupt. But also because these governments were doing the bidding of the United States and Western powers. Peña Nieto opened up the oil industry to private investment. Calderon tried to do the same. Salinas de Gortari privatized large chunks of the Mexican state. Cedillo continued with the privatization, sold off the train network, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These governments were doing American bidding. So you weren't going to hear as much about what was going on. You'd hear little things here and there. But basically, there was a great deal of complicity. As I've talked about in Jacobin, Felipe Calderon's security secretary, Garcia Luna, was in hoc to the Sinaloa cartel. The United States knew this, and the money from the Merida Plan that militarized the country, continued to flow to these governments. The Plan Merida money, Fast and Furious, and all these other operations funneled weapons into Mexico. So America was there giving money and weapons to these openly and desperately corrupt governments, which were selling off chunks of the state, committing all kinds of illegalities, and in many cases had elements of collusion with organized crime. So this is what the referendum is about, and this is why the referendum is so important. And it's going to be really the time when the AMLO administration is going to be shaking the timbers a bit of an elite which has done very well in the AMLO administration. Billionaires have become 20% richer during the pandemic. Big construction interests are getting all kinds of government contracts from AMLO's infrastructure projects. The Maya train is being built partly by Slim and the Carso consortium, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really going to be a test to see to what extent, what extent this is just going to be an exercise in popular referendum, or to what extent there will be repercussions afterwards. Because I mentioned it's going to be pretty hard to close the door on this once the referendum happens, once the referendum takes place. Now, a couple of other points to make, right? First of all, as we saw today, Morena held a rally in Mexico City to start to generate support for the referendum. And one of the most important speakers at that referendum was Omar Garcia, who was one of the survivors of Ayotzinapa. Now, Ayotzinapa, although there have been some advances in the Ayotzinapa investigation, and they've found one or two more of the bodies of the students that were disappeared, the case has not been broken open, and it's been 3 years. Again, the public has been patient, and the AMLO administration has been much more forthcoming about it than the Peña Nieto administration, which was involved in it and committed it. But still, the clock is ticking on this. And remember the case of General Cienfuegos, who was returned to Mexico by the United States for lack of evidence when they arrested him. And it looked like they had a very thin case from the DEA. But that doesn't obviate the fact that Cienfuegos protected members of the military from being interviewed in the case, right? And is also involved in another massacre and giving the order on the massacre in Tlatlaya. So the question is, to what extent would this referendum open things up? Because it's not just about former presidents, it's about former political actors. Will the former political actors include generals? Will the former political actors include the military, who were involved in massacres in previous administrations? Will they include the crimes of the former presidents that I mentioned and other members of the administration? To what extent will this go? And to the extent that it will go, will show the extent to which the AMLO administration is devoted to attacking corruption, not only corruption from here forward, but the whole network, the whole political mafia that ran the country and created the disaster that the country got to. And that's an open question. Another point to mention is that whatever happens with this referendum, and it's funny that the critics of AMLO, they didn't like, for example, when he held a referendum on whether to cancel the airport project in Mexico City and start a new one, because it said it wasn't an official referendum. They just held it they improvised one. So they didn't like that one. But now they don't like this one either, even though it's going to be an official referendum, with, all the legal backing in place. They don't like this one either. So it's really going to be, whatever happens in this referendum, it will have opened the door to future referendums in Mexico. So some people are agitating now that the next referendum should be on whether to nationalize the nation's lithium supplies, which are in Sonora and have been, as of yet, untouched. Whether to nationalize them, before foreign companies can get their mitts on them. Whether we should hold a national referendum on legalizing abortion. Right, AMLO has kind of been very careful to fob off socialists, just saying, "Oh, those can be decided by referendums." Well, let's do it now that the precedent will have been set for holding a national referendum, right, following the law and all the legal procedures, right. So let's do other ones. Let's do more now. Let's have more referenda. So I think that's another important point too, that the door will now have been open to future referenda going forward. So again, now just to sum up, as we're about to finish, Sunday, August 1st, the referendum on whether to investigate and, as necessary, prosecute the crimes of the past by former presidents, and not only former presidents. It's very likely to pass. It has 80% support, but you can see that one of the strategies of the right going forward will be to try to delegitimize the referendum. As we saw that the National Electoral Institute has been dragging its feet, that's one strategy. Another strategy, and we saw this by Vicente Fox, former President Fox, in one of his tweets. Fox, who's been increasingly kind of off his rocker in recent years, kind of went through a whole list of other things that supposedly they could then try AMLO for in the future, and then said, friends, let's not lend ourselves to this farce. Don't participate in the referendum on August 1st. So the idea is that they're going to, if Fox is listened to, and, I don't know if he's listened to by anyone anymore, the guy is it's kind of crazy tweets. The idea would be essentially to kind of boycott the referendum, again, to try to delegitimize it. And if whether it wins by 80 or 90%, say, well, look, it only won because only AMLO supporters participated, right? Only Morena supporters participated. That's going to be another way that they're going to try to delegitimize the referendum, right? And it remains to be seen how many people will get out and vote, right? That's an important point to be considered as well. And then finally, we've talked a lot about, Morena won the elections handily, the midterm elections, but there are some serious internal divisions in Morena that have to be dealt with. And I hope Morena knows what it's walking into, right? Because once this referendum happens, and then once any investigations or prosecutions happen as a result of it, you can just imagine what the international press is going to say about it, right? AMLO the dictator, AMLO the authoritarian, AMLO the intolerant is he's actually physically putting his opponents in jail, right? The Latin American banana republic dictator, right? Regardless of the fact that this is a legally constituted referendum, regardless of the fact that the crimes of the past were bloody and serious and need to be prosecuted, right? I mean, that the victims from north to south in this country are clamoring for the justice of Ayotzinapa, of the drug war, of Actial, of all of these massacres and crimes and corruption and scandal and funneling of resources and deviation of resources and anything you can imagine. Doesn't matter. The international corporate press will be all over AMLO dictator, AMLO dictator, AMLO dictator. And so I hope Morena is ready and prepared, right, to be able to face up to that and parry that effectively. So that's where we're at. I'll be covering it on the day of the referendum, and I'll be talking more ahead of that. I'm sure there's going to be long lines because there's going to be a lot fewer precincts open. Again, it's very likely to win. Whether it will get 40% participation is another question. That would require about 38 million people to get out and vote in this. And considering that the National Electoral Institute has done almost nothing to promote it as of now, Morena is going to have to do a lot of work to get its supporters out. So there we are, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'll be back again soon. Follow me on Twitter as Kurt Hackbarth and my articles in Jacobin. Very quickly, if you want to know more about some of these crimes of the past that that would be investigated under this referendum, you can check some of my pieces in Jacobin. Felipe Calderon's administration had ties to drug cartels in the United States, knew all along, and Enrique Peña Nieto and his corrupt government stole from the Mexican people, very literally, and there's some more information there. So thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again.